Ah, you've listened to our podcast.
I have. I especially had to listen to that Dan Santat episode to see what he cheated me out of.
Yes.
I think the term you used was Dan Santat snaked in. And when I saw it was the 100th episode, I was like, now hate is all I know.
Hi, everybody. I'm Matt.
And I'm Steve.
And this is Marvel Reread Club.
And I'm George.
Oh, wait. Here we have George. We have a special guest, George O'Connor, who is an absolutely fantastic graphic novelist. He did 12 amazing graphic novels about the Olympic gods. And then he decided that he wasn't done, and he was going to start a new series of graphic novels about the Norse gods, the Asgardians series, of which he has published 2, Odin and Thor. Well, we saw this, and we figured we had to have George on the show to talk about how his comics about the Norse gods differ from the legendary Marvel comics about the Norse gods, and how he manages
virtually
to
identical.
be in that shadow. They are very different. Both Steve and I read your 2 graphic novels, and they are so different from the Lee Kirby. And yet, if you look at the Tales of Asgard, especially the earlier Tales of Asgard backups, which we didn't necessarily ask you to read, but I assume you may have read, they're both sort of telling a lot of origin stories, a lot of stories directly from the prose and poetic Edda of Snorri Sturluson in very different ways. How do you, George, deal with the shadow of Lee and Kirby when you are doing your own comics about the Norse gods?
So let me just say, first off, I'm an enormous fan of what Lee and Kirby did. My big entry point into superhero comics was actually Walt Simonson's run.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I was a mythology kid before I was a real... Well, okay. I always loved comics, but I was more like a Conan sort of guy. And when I was in, I want to say 6th grade, my mom bought me an issue of the what was then current Simonson run.
Mm-hmm.
And that was eye-opening for me. It made me a huge Marvel fan, but like I was in the middle of really being in my big first Norse mythology kick, and I'm like, these are very off in some ways. But also, at the time when Walt Simonson was doing it, he was actually quite close in many other ways. Like, you know, he made a conscious effort to bring these tales a little bit closer to what existed in the Eddas, which good name drop of Snorri Sturluson, by the way. Best name ever of anyone.
And Walt would drop that name fairly often.
Certainly, Simonson's run was much less sci-fi tinged than Lee and Kirby's run, which is an interesting change. And in the MCU movies, they brought some of that science fiction stuff back in, I think, to marry it up a little bit more with what we've got. One thing I want to say before we get too far into this stuff, so I don't forget it, is on page 42 of your Thor graphic novel, where 3 of the dwarves are showing one of their things they built, which is the fold-up Viking ship.
Yeah.
Years ago, there was a stand-up comedian who had a bit, which I have always remembered, which is saying that, like, all right, well, there's the difference between the Vikings of old who would pillage, and then now you've got the Swedes, Norwegians, whatever, which just seems so peaceful. And it's like, what happened? Why did they stop pillaging? And then the answer was, well, their Viking ships came in IKEA flat packs and they lost the Allen key. And so they couldn't go and raid villages and pillage and all this stuff anymore. So I got to page 42. I was like, oh my God.
Yeah, Skidbladnir, the greatest of ships, which was able to fold into a little thin piece of wood. It does. It looks, now that you mention it, which I feel like I wish I had played it up with an Allen key in there. Like, yeah, they're constructing like it is literally said to be in the Poetic Edda, the greatest of all ships. And it's just this weird piece of like cardboard that folds out infinitely into like a Viking boat. Obviously, I'm a fan of Marvel and their version of Thor and Odin and the other Norse gods. But I do love that there is this kind of, as you said, shadow or elephant in the room that I get to work across. Like when I pitched this to my publisher, the first line of the pitch I made was, Loki is not Thor's brother. He's Odin's blood brother. So if anything, he's Thor's uncle. Like just playing against these things, everybody thinks they know, but all right, this is the bit where I very lightly put Stan and Jack on blast.
Okay.
Clearly, when the feature started, I should say, in Journey into Mystery, Jack was probably plotting, Stan was supplying scripts to whatever degree, but I don't think either one of them had really done any sort of refreshing on what Norse mythology was. I think they Thor, he had a hammer, right? And you could kind of see elements get brought in here, drips and drabs. And like, I don't think Loki being his brother was a conscious decision. I think they made a mistake. Like, the same way Odin has two eyes throughout. Like, they're just like, they really hadn't read. And it's about the third year of the strip, or maybe it's when like Rascally Roy Thomas is rearing his head more. You could see they're like, we have to do some effort to bring this a little bit closer. Mm-hmm. And it's like you were saying, like the Tales of Asgard stuff, like they're suddenly they're mining the myths as like a source. Whereas before it's like he's finding stone men from Saturn and making weird androids and stuff. Like there was a weird gloss of like Thor just being a hippie with a hammer that was thrown over this like story of a doctor. And they kind of like realized pretty far in, they're like, oh, you know what? I don't think anybody cares about Donald Blake. Let's do some of this cool myth stuff.
Yes, there is definitely a separation. And obviously the biggest part of that separation is when they decide to go ahead and write Jane Foster out of the book and replace her with Sif as the new Asgardian girlfriend who has no role in the Earth. And he at first is like, okay, well, I got to go back to Earth and be Donald Blake. And Sif's like, well, what am I going to do? I'm your girlfriend. And he's like, you're going to do nothing, baby. You're going to sit here and wait for me in Asgard for if or when I come back. And she's like, but I'm your girlfriend. You can't just cut me out of your life like this. And he's like, sorry. And she's like, fine, I'm a goddess. I do not beg. Go ahead, go on. And so you have this huge problem in the books that we're reading right now, where he's got this whole Asgardian life and he's still got this like little remnant of his Earth life, but he no longer even has a secretary. He no longer has anyone he can interact with in his office, and it's one thing if Thor was still in the Avengers, then you'd be like, well, he has to be a superhero if he's going to be in the Avengers, but he's not in the Avengers at this point. He could just have strictly Asgardian adventures and have no connection to Earth at all. I think it's odd when they do have him return to Earth for just a couple issues and be done Blake again. So as we were saying here before we started officially recording, we were going to have you on to do the annuals, and then you inconveniently got married and you were,
I know, how dare I,
away on your honeymoon when it was time to record the annuals. So we went ahead and replaced you with Dan Santat, who snaked the job out from under you. It's a real shame, though, because that was a great 30-page Thor issue entirely set in Asgard with lots of great Thor, Odin, Loki interactions. It would have been a great issue to do with you. And then since then, we've had some Don Blake issues where I'm like, oh, well, it's just as well we're not going ahead and inviting George on for this. But then I was waiting for this issue where not only do we have a great Tales of Asgard backup with Volstagg, but we have a great leading story with, a pretty great leading story that at least has Thor and Odin, and it does not have Loki, but it does have Baldur and Sif, and it's got these new Asgardian villains, the Enchanters. I don't know. Should we go ahead and jump into that?
We're going to start with Thor, yeah. I just want to say, too, I know what I'm pretty excited about? This is my favorite Thor art team. Bill Everett is not heralded as one of the great inkers of Kirby, but in my opinion, he is my favorite.
He is.
And you don't want to see Everett work too much because Everett's amazing, like doing his own, as we'll talk later in his Namor story, The Submariner. But man, Everett and Kirby is my zone. Like, he doesn't do enough, but when there's an issue where it's the two of them, I'm like, yes, it's delicious. Everett brings just the right line weights and everything to like what Kirby does. He brings every little detail. He draws the rubble, the textures, the scales, everything so beautifully. So I was very excited I got to do this one.
Yes, we should explain that this is a one-issue tease where Vince Guarda has been inking this book for several years now over Kirby and really doing a pretty terrible job, although he's been getting better. And whenever we have people on as guests, we're like, okay, what do you think of Guarda? And we got to have a whole discussion out of that. Well, we're not going to get to that discussion today because we get just this one-issue tease where Glenn is gone from the book and Bill Everett is inking. It says produced in living color by Stan the Manly and Jack King Kirby, embellished by Bill Everett, who does both the top feature and Tales of Asgard, lettered by Sam Rose and True Believers all. And it is gorgeous. You can just tell right away from these faces on the first page where we have Thor at a soda fountain drinking soda pop, and the face on the soda jerk. My grandfather was a soda jerk, by the way, me and Steve's grandfather back in the day. And the face on the soda jerk is just something that Coletta could not ink in a million years. It is pure Everett inking.
Yeah, everything about this opening sequence is so nicely done. It weirdly, by coincidence, the books that we're looking at today, there's a couple of encounters of Marvel superheroes with fans of a ravenous quality, which I guess this is the age of Beatlemania. Well, a little bit post Beatlemania, but it's something that they're clearly thinking. But like this whole bit where like Thor's just sitting there and there's these people staring at him. There's this one woman on page 2, panel 2,
Yep.
just has a kind of close up staring at him so nakedly, just like no dialogue. I'm like, is that the Enchantress in disguise? Like,
Right.
just
She's
I love
looking
it.
at him like, he will be mine.
Yeah, it's so great. And it's one of those things that reminds me how Kirby has this background as a romance comic artist. And the amount of back material, like the little bits he throws in, just serve to enrich his book so much more. Some of the books we'll talk about today don't have that to the same quality. And it's, it's a shame. Like, even though I don't think Kirby knows how to adequately depict the young people of the time period, these seem like they're more from like the late 50s or really early 60s and 67. But he's still capturing this thing. Just like, it's so awesome. I love it.
Yeah. So quick recap of the issue. So we begin, and soon shall come the Enchanter's delightful sequence where Thor is drinking it looks like a root beer float at a soda fountain. All of the teens are enamored of him. The soda jerk is enamored of him. Of course, whenever Thor has these encounters with people, they always end the same way. They always end with Thor going, by the way, I know nothing of human money. I can't pay for this, which we've had him dealing with this a long time. You would think at this point he would go ahead. And by the way, you are also Don Blake, and you have a
he knows.
job. You know all about human money. You're just completely trying to get out of paying for things. You could easily have some money on you. But then we cut to Asgard. We get to see the Rainbow Bridge leading up to Asgard, something you have drawn in your own books, George. And we see just a quick cut to Odin. We unfortunately don't get a Odin-Thor interactions in this issue, which I would have loved to have gotten your perspective on. But we get a beautiful splash page of Odin in one of his magnificent crowns. So, George, you are presumably familiar with the idea that Kirby had a rule that he always had to draw Odin in a different crown than he'd ever drawn him in before.
And a different throne.
Yeah, different throne and different crown.
Well, I can't say I noticed the throne thing because I feel like Kirby's backgrounds, like his environments are always so mutable. But like the fact that Odin is like the most glam of dramatic dressers, it's amazing. I will point out, though, like I said, he didn't do his homework. We're staring into both of Odin's yellow eyes in here.
Yes.
It's like, shouldn't one of those be in the well of Mimir somewhere?
I think there's an idea here that may have been intentional or unintentional on Sanjak's part, that we are somewhat early on in the Norse myths. Later, Roy Thomas is writing the book, and Roy Thomas is like, I will go ahead and just include now around issue 280 or so. Odin plucks his eyeball out in order to gain knowledge and then is one-eyed from that point on. So in the comics we were reading growing up, Odin was one-eyed. And I was really shocked to go back and read these old comics from the 60s and early 70s in which he was two-eyed.
Yeah, I always thought that Roy Thomas was a flashback. I've tried reading those Roy Thomases and I can't. I flip through them. It's just the Kirby Jack run is some of the greatest stuff of the 60s. It's like it doesn't get as much credit as the Fantastic Four, but I prefer it because it's just beautiful.
I would maybe prefer it if you switch Senat and Coletta. It would be interesting to see. I might then prefer Thor to Fantastic Four, but with Coletta on Thor and Senat on Fantastic Four, it's easy choice for me to pick Fantastic Four as my favorite.
Yeah, Vince can be disappointing. We need an alternate dimension where Bill Everett was the go-to inker on Thor, and it's the best book Marvel ever does.
That is entirely possible.
He's there all the time. Yeah.
We just get a tease of that in this one issue, and next issue, Coletta will be back, shockingly. But eventually Everett will get a longer run on the book later. So then he decides to go back to Don Blake's office. He has some brief Don Blake interaction, which I will mercifully spare you. And then we cut to Balder and Sif, who were sent on a quest in the previous issue. And then they come up against the Enchanters. Well, first they come up against a sort of golem-type goon who they are fighting, who is sent by the Enchanters. And then we actually get to see the Enchanters. We get our second gorgeous splash page of the issue on page 11, where we have the Enchanters sort of prefiguring to a certain extent Armin Zola, a later Kerbin creation, in that they all have little faces on their chests. But this is in addition to having actual heads, unlike Arnim Zola, I forget which one. So then they realize, the Enchanters are bad. We'd better go to Earth and contact Thor. And they do. They find Don Blake. They convince him to become Thor. They convince him to confront the Enchanters. Meanwhile, the Enchanters have split up, and two of the three have come to Earth. Next issue, this Battleground Earth. George, do you have anything more to say about this issue before we move on to Tales of Asgard?
It's nice to see the Sif and Balder side quest. Since we already kind of talked about this, a couple of things that I feel like were missed opportunities with these characters. Like Balder in Norse mythology has been promised by everything in existence except for mistletoe to never harm him.
Mhm.
And I feel like if they had only known this, it would have been cool to have him be like kind of a low rent juggernaut where he like his power is he's absolutely indestructible. So like, he takes some good hits here. He beats up that golem he described. I'm always amused by Marvel's Sif. And I actually think she is an improvement upon the mythological Sif. So I don't know how versed you are in mythology, the mythological version of Sif, but she in mythology is the wife of Thor. She is the mother of his sons, Magni and Modi, who take up his hammer after he dies in Ragnarok. But the one myth she really figures majorly in is the myth about the creation of Mjolnir, where it begins with Loki shaving her bald in her sleep.
This will later be covered in the Thor comics. The dwarves make her black hair to replace the blonde hair that she used to have. So I was surprised when I read your books and you told the story that the dwarves make her blonde hair again.
They make her hair literally out of gold that grows. Yeah. I think it was that they designed the character with black hair before reading that, like, the one thing we know about her, she has blonde hair.
Okay.
It's great. But, she's got this great, like, dimension hopping power. Like, she's this very capable swords person. Like, she fights really well. Stan does his typical, like, I'm just a woman type stuff to undermine it as much as he can. But like mostly it's like Jack shows her really holding her own, and she's a pretty awesome character, like in terms of that, especially for the time period.
Yes.
And I will point out, you said that they hadn't realized that Balder, couldn't be harmed by anything but mistletoe. They just forgot, because his very first introduction in Tales of Asgard a couple of years ago, that was the whole structure of the story, was that, nothing could harm him. So, yeah, no, they just forgot.
Yeah.
Or didn't care.
Well, or decided that much pot armor wouldn't make for a good character.
They're like, let's make a good story here. Like, the sidekick to Thor who can't be hurt. Like, let's get rid of that detail.
Yeah,
right.
I agree.
Right. So the only thing that I have to add here on that little aside with Dr. Blake, which you mercifully spared us from, he does have one little bit there about how healing people and giving people the news that they are not sick and that they will be fine is something that is even more dear to him than any of the joys he can get from godhood. So it does at least give us a little bit of something to hang our hat on as to why he persists in being Don Blake, even though it makes no sense.
Yeah.
Also, there's just in the background, there's a moving van that says Forbush Trucking Company, which, little running joke.
And folks, if you have the issue in front of you, like, just look how beautiful that panel is. It's just an establishing shot of Sif and Balder standing in the middle of the street, stopping traffic so that a cop's eventually like, oh, Don Blake. That guy knows who Thor is. Go ask him to find Thor. It's just full of all those chunky Kirby shapes. Everything's overlapping with this great line weight. And that's the sort of thing that, since I didn't get to badmouth Vince Coletta, this will be my one thing I say. Like, I bet a lot of that would have disappeared before being inked had it been Vince doing this issue.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. It could have been disappeared, or it could have just looked very flat.
Or scratchy or sloppy, or the various things that Vince Coletta would do to pencilers. Yes, I am so glad you got to do this issue. Well, let's go ahead and jump to the back of the book. Another issue that you were very lucky to get to do, To the Death, Tales of Asgard, Home of the Mighty Norse Gods, Stan the Manly, and Jack King Kirby, plus Bill Everett and Bellisher and Artie Semic-Letter have created Jan Saga just for thee. One of the many things Coletta isn't good with is beautiful women. And we have a beautiful woman here on the first page that could only have been inked by Everett. We didn't get much Volstagg in the last couple of issues because he was off on his little side quest where he was off chasing after women, even though they are raiding the Mystic Mountain of Mogul and they are in the middle of a huge action sequence. He is now wooing this woman. By my beard, I've met with greater success than I dared hope. Yon flirtatious female is sister to Mogul of the Magic Mountain. Thou art to be congratulated, fair lady. Thou hast won the favor of valiant Volstagg himself. She is like, oh yeah, well, I really love guys like you. I'm going to be all loving on you. Why don't you stand right here and I'll just yank this cord. And then he's like, whoa, well, if you like me, let me hug on you while I'm doing it. And she's like, no, don't hug on me while I'm pulling this cord. And she's like, I was releasing a trap door to put you in the dungeon. And now you've dragged me there with you because you snaked your hand around me while I was doing it. And then she's like, oh, great. Now we're both going to be killed. There is Mutoris, a huge centaur-like monster.
Oh, Minotaur.
Minotaur. Did I say centaur? Minotaur.
A couple of guys had to jump in there.
Yes, who is attacking them. And then there's So much great dialogue here. I've said before that Volstagg may be my favorite Marvel hero, and this is one of Volstagg's all-time best showcases. She says, only in flight can there be safety. And he says, flight, dost thou expect one such as I to flee from danger? Quickly, woman, show me the way. And then they're running. And then she's like, well, I might as well tell you now that there is an enchanted rod of wondrous wizard power here, because it's the only way you can save me from this Minotaur. And he grabs it and is like, whoa, this thing is awesome. It is kicking ass. Gorgeous Everett inks. Looks like Synod inks. Does not look at all like how Vince Cotta would have inked this. Meanwhile, we just cut briefly to Thor and Hogan and Fandral, who are in a big fight with the 40 demon horsemen who we've seen in previous issues. Then it says at the end, thus shall the very fruit of Asgard battle unto death. And Volstagg is about to show up with his mighty new weapon and save the day, which is a little spoiler for next issue. So, obviously, I would say that Stan Lee's greatest addition to the Norse myths is the Warriors 3, who are not in any way, shape, or form in the Norse myths, correct?
No, not even anything that you could even assume is close to it. He just made this up whole cloth, or Stan or Jack, whomever. Everything we just described, I want to stress to listeners, that was 5 pages.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's so packed. And it is an instance where, I think, Stan and Jack are like the Beatles. Apart, they never did anything as good, although they were still very talented. On page 2, the bit that you were describing with him snaking his arm around her, that was a rare instance where there was a lot of description, but I think you actually kind of needed it. It's a little confusing, like the bit where she's pulling it and then suddenly they're falling down the hole when she's pulling the trap. But the way that Stan writes that is so funny.
Yes.
Shall I gladden her spirit by placing a noble arm gratefully around her waist? And the next panel is them just falling. And she's like, let go of me, you blubbering buffoon. It's funny.
It is.
It is. And I will point out a little bit of dialogue on the previous panel before those two. Volstagg is saying, I fear I must leave thee now, for if thou speakest too long to Volstagg, thou wilt have ears no more for lesser men. She says, all too true, my lord. What other mere warrior could compare with thine own courage, thine own wit, thine own considerable girth? Which, I'm like, yes, Volstagg's girth has ruined her for other men at this point.
I love the way he's twiddling his mustache as he says that too. Like, he's such a smooth, he's being a real fandral there.
Oh, and you talked about how much was packed into these 5 pages. Each page was 4 panels rather than the usual sort of 5, 6, 7 panels that we usually get from Kirby. And yet we were still able to get so much packed in. But when Volstagg gets hold of this big magic bazooka thing and he's shocked and surprised by what it does, he says, odds blood, not even the powerful limbs of Volstagg can control the enchanted rod. One thing that, rod. But one thing that always gets me a little bit in these Thor comics is when they speak oaths or exclamations that actually come from Christian stuff, in that odds blood, that's God's blood, as in the blood of Jesus. Right?
Oh.
And then I
think it might be something different. There is a Vanir god who is the husband of Freya, named either Od or Odar, like ODR. The way I handle this book, he only gets mentioned, because he's essentially thought to be another name for Odin. There's a whole thing about the Vanir gods where Freya and Frigg are echoes of each other. Like, you could argue that they're probably the same goddess at one point. And Freya has a missing husband who would go out on these adventures named Od or Odar. And that's hard to say aloud without saying you're saying Odor. And she cries these tears of gold lamenting his loss. So again, I've been coming down on these guys for not knowing their myths, but maybe at this point, they've gotten a copy of Edith Hamilton's mythology and are kind of getting a few things out of it.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, I will say that Od's blood was something from Shakespearean times that was used in that other context. And also, for that matter, Zounds is actually probably pronounced Zoons because it's a reference to God's wounds. So that always jumps out at me a little bit in these things.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because Stan Lee always had his gods speaking in what could be read as Shakespearean English based on Stan's love of Shakespeare, and that's sort of the way they're talking, or it could be read as Jacobean English. It could be that Stan is having them talk this way because this is the way they talk in the King James Bible, and says, I say thee nay, not even Mogul could feed a slave such as thee. This is very much the language of the King James Bible, but it's also the language of Shakespeare. And I think that both King James Bible and Shakespeare, huge influences on Stan. And of course, then there's always a rumor that Shakespeare contributed to the King James Bible and supposedly hid his name in there.
What?
Yes, there's one book of the King James Bible in which like the 23rd word from the beginning is shake and the 23rd word from the end is spear, and Shakespeare
What?
and the people are saying this is proof that Shakespeare was secretly a contributor to the King James Bible and hid his name in it, but probably not true.
It certainly would have made a lot of sense since he was acknowledged pretty much as the greatest writer of his age, and he was writing during the time that the King James translation was being made.
Yes.
And Shakespeare was sponsored by the king. So it would seem to me actually unlikely that he did not contribute, but there's no real evidence of that.
I hope that's true just because I love the sheer presumptiveness of that.
Yes.
Like, I love like I'm going to insert myself into what is going to be considered the inviolable word of God. I mean, it is the King James version. We know, like, but still, that's this. I just have thank you for supplying me with the rabbit hole. I will be spending the latter half of my day disappearing down. Like, did Shakespeare write the Bible? I'll be sure to report back the strange things I uncover.
Go look for that.
I'm sure you will find all sorts of strange stuff.
Okay. Do we have any final words? Obviously, George, we considered it. We asked you, like, do you want to just join us for Thor? Because that's the thing that is going to help you push your own paper. Or do you want to join us for everything? And you're like, I want to do everything. I want to do all 9 books. We should explain that you have a podcast with Riley Brown, and that he has been our guest, and he was a guest for all 9 books. And so then you seem to have taken that as a challenge, and you asked to be a guest for all 9 books yourself, correct?
Yeah. So Riley did do all 9, which I'm like, I got to at least match Riley. But it was also out of the desire, the scope of what you do, where you analyze everything that came out within a certain month is very interesting to me because, I mean, I wasn't alive then. So it's called the Marvel Reread, right? I would say maybe about half of these books I had read previously. Mm-hmm. So it was a reread in that sense. But like to see what stuff was coming out concurrent, seeing everything that was published within a calendar month was very, very interesting to me. And it really showcased what I think is one of the genius bits of Marvel, especially in those early years, that feeling of a shared universe. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The way like they would just be like, oh, here's like, you know, in a couple of panels of this Captain America story, there's the Avengers. And it's the same Avengers you see in Avengers that month. And they're just having a phone call as Captain America is strangely hanging at an airport with no flights to take. And there's just all these. That was weird, right? We'll get to that.
That's weird. We'll get to it.
Yes. Okay.
But it was just so cool to see this. And I'm like, okay, previously I would have read entire runs, you know, on the Marvel app, start to finish, or, you know, maybe read like a issue that gets mentioned a lot because it has historical significance. But a lot of the stuff I'd never seen before. It was just kind of like weird in between issues. So this was a really fun experience for me to see what was coming out of Marvel in this time period.
Very cool. Personally, for me, context is everything on, you know, most things in life. And that's one of the reasons why when Matt started doing this thing, I'm like, that sounds like something that would carry me through. But let's go ahead and move on to Amazing Spider-Man, if that's okay.
Yes.
Yep. All right. So this is Amazing Spider-Man number 51. The cover says, in the clutches of the Kingpin, and we see Spider-Man looking like he has been beat up and trying to get up off the ground as he is surrounded by Kingpin and some general mobsters. On the splash page, first of all, credits. What is that? The city his? Not if Stan Lee and John Romita can do anything about it. And that goes for Mickey DeMeo, inker, and Sam Rosen, letterer as well. Once again, Mickey DeMeo is actually Mike Esposito under a pseudonym. The splash page, I assumed when I first saw this was sort of an allegorical splash page. We see Kingpin smashing his fist with a little pinky, I guess not a pinky ring, with, I guess that's actually his wedding ring. We later find out he is married, but with a big gaudy diamond in it, smashing the city with buildings falling down everywhere. Next page, we find out, oh, wait, no, he actually had a model of the city on his desk that he was smashing for no good reason.
Hey, if you're going to claim that you're going to destroy the city, you can't just claim that. They're just meaningless words unless you have someone make you a balsa wood model of the city and then bring it and set it on your desk, and then you smash it with your giant fist. And then that way people will understand what you were trying to say.
Kingpin versus Godzilla at that point,
yes.
Right? Okay, so this is the first time I think we really find out that J. Jonah Jameson is anything other than just a Spider-Man conspiracy theorist who is just throwing stuff out there to sell papers with no regard for the truth. He is publishing these editorials saying, hey, there's something going on with crime in the city, and it looks like something big is going on, and someone's trying to take over the mobs. So he's actually sort of a muckraking journalist in some ways at this point, or he's being shown to have that side to him.
Yeah, and I've always loved that side. Reading comics as a kid, when you find out that J. Jonah Jameson, except for where he had no ethics and no perspective on Spider-Man, that he was otherwise a very ethical and upstanding anti-mob, anti-mafia, anti-corruption journalist.
Yes, and we also have the backdoor introduction in a few pages of his black editor-in-chief, whom we've never seen before, but we are going to see in a minute. And once again, in 1967, having a black man in a position of that much power in your organization was not nothing. Anyway, so Kingpin says to some of his toughs, you need to go and find Jameson. And it's funny, he says, we'll make him an offer to play ball with us. And so I had to go and look this up, and The Godfather had not been written yet. It was going to be published like next year, and then the movie was a couple of years after that. I just don't know whether this, we're going to make him an offer was sort of a running under, sort of something in the cultural zeitgeist about mobsters or not. And I have not been able to determine that.
There's that story Stan would often tell about how Mario Puzo applied for a job at Marvel Comics.
Oh, I did not know this story.
Yeah, I'm not going to, because I didn't have it ready to go offhand, but there's something like where when he was serving as editor, when Stan, he got a script submission from a young Mario Puzo. And he was like, nah, kid, stick to writing novels. And then he wrote The Godfather and everything. So I wonder, maybe that's a line.
Wow, that is a wonderful point of speculation. I will never give that one up.
Let's call in the Puzo kid. Hey, Puzo, what should Kingpin say? I don't know. Something about make him an offer? Good job, Puzo. Now go back to work writing novels.
Good, now get out of here, go write a novel.
So Kingpin sends the rest of the goons in the room off to go and do essentially a robbery or whatever of a gas station. And they're like, this seems below us. But he's like, I'm trying to figure out who to trust here. So you go out and do this. Spider-Man, whom the mob all thinks is dead or retired or somehow out of the way, shows up and stops this robbery. We get a silly bit in the middle of this. Some of the goons seem to have Spider-Man trapped, which, he can lift 30 tons or something like that. So I don't know how you would go about doing this. But another one of the mobsters comes up and says, once I let you have one solid karate chop, it'll be all over. So hold that pose, mister. Here it comes. I mean, I've heard of telegraphing a punch before, but geez, that is something entirely different. We then see more about Foswell. He had run all the mobs in town until he went straight and worked as a crime reporter. I think it was a poor choice, but Stan Lee has decided to make him go bad again, and he thought he was going to muscle in on Kingpin and push him out of the way, but it's clear that's not happening.
I really think this is a shame. I liked Foswell a lot as the reformed ex-con turned crime reporter. I thought that was a good character. I thought he could have gone for another 100 issues. Having him turn bad again, one of the big problems with it is it turns JJJ into a naive liberal character, someone who wrongly believed that ex-cons could go straight and falsely put his trust in an ex-con when he should never have trusted him. And that's the last thing I want JJJ to be. I don't want JJJ to be, a naive liberal reformer who doesn't understand the way the world really works. I think that's totally out of character. So I'm not a fan of this plot turn.
Anyway, so Foswell is going to be brought in by Kingpin to be one of his key lieutenants, it sounds like. But then these goons who were beat up by Spider-Man come in and they're like, all right, Kingpin, you said that Spider-Man was out of the way. You obviously don't know what you're talking about. I'm going to kick your butt. And so he goes up and tries to punch him. And this is where we find out that Kingpin isn't just a big fat man, but he is a very powerful man, more like an old-time strong man. Yeah, and so on page 9, panel 4, this is where we just take a glimpse of Robbie Robertson. Isn't that his name?
Yes.
Or is that the name of the lead singer of the band?
Yes. I always get them confused. The lead singer of the band is Robbie Robertson. This is Robert Joe Robinson. It's one of these things where Stanley can't keep his first name right, so they have to establish that he has the first names Robbie and Joe because Stanley gets confused. But this is Robinson, not Robertson.
That is his first appearance right there, that one little panel?
It is, and they don't name him. They don't talk about him
No.
being hired. It's really weird. But yeah, that's his first appearance. So Jameson is freaking out because his crime reporter has gone AWOL. He doesn't know why yet, and there's a crime wave going on. So he's like, what the heck? And then meanwhile, Peter Parker, one of his good crime photographers, has disappeared. And so he doesn't know what to do. So he's going to call in Ned Leeds, make him his new crime reporter. And Peter Parker walks back in at this point with some photos. JJJ is very upset with him, is going to send him out and kick him out on his butt. But then, of course, he sees the Spider-Man pictures that Peter Parker has, and he welcomes him back in. We just see a brief aside of the rest of the sort of Archie cast that we've got, just to remind you they're part of the book, but it's just 2 panels just there, I think, because Romita wanted to draw pretty girls for at least a couple of panels.
Yes, and we have Gwen without her headband, which always looks very odd.
Yeah, she looks like an old lady without the headband, doesn't she?
She does.
Peter Parker just happens to drive by one of these mob shakedowns, this time of a fancy gentleman's club. At this point, I actually was wondering at first, like, wait, is this supposed to be Jonah's gentleman's club and they're looking for him? But I don't think the dialogue says that. So anyway, he happens to have his spider sense go off as he's going by here, comes in, foils this robbery, saves the lives of a bunch of these people as things are going to collapse on top of them. Then we see the mobsters get to J. Jonah Jameson's office. Apparently, Jonah is, again, working late because he actually is a hard, diligent worker at his newspaper. And he's the only one in the office. The mobsters come in and essentially kidnap him and take him to Kingpin, who makes him his offer. And once again, JJJ stands by his principles and is not going to do what they want him to do. And then Kingpin goes and drops Foswell's name while Jameson is there in the room. Yeah. And Foswell's like, what? Now they know who I am. He's like, yeah, they do. No going back where you came from. You're mine now, buddy.
But then Jameson says, so I was wrong to ever trust you. So
I don't like that. Page 16, that first panel, it took me a while to figure out what the heck the perspective was on that. It just made no sense to me. I eventually was able to piece it together, what Romita was intending, which in comic book storytelling world is not what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to have things just immediately read as what you're supposed to see. Yeah. It would take too long and be too hard to explain why it looks weird to the listener here, but it's just you're looking through a glass window and it's unclear what exactly the perspective is on the action inside the window from outside.
Yeah, none of it works. Spider-Man's relationship to it, it's odd. It is a weird panel.
Yeah, and we'll post the panel on our Marvel Reread Club page for this issue so that you can take a look.
Yes. So Spider-Man then lures some of these goons out of Kingpin's office. Oh, because he'd sent a spider tracer on one of these goons. That's how he tracks down where they are. Takes care of some of the goons. Kingpin comes out to fight him himself. Spider-Man breaks his laser cane.
Never to be seen again, I don't believe.
I don't know. Who knows? Kingpin, once again, we've established he's actually quick and powerful. Although, once again, Spidey can press like 30 tons, so I don't know if you're going to be that powerful. But Kingpin, is really giving him his money's worth. And then eventually his little diamond cravat pin apparently can expel gas that goes ahead and knocks Spider-Man to the ground. J. Jonah Jameson is like, Spider-Man beaten? It's what I always wanted, but not now, not like this. Yeah, not when he could have actually helped me.
Also, while J. Jonah Jameson was blindfolded, so he didn't get to see it.
Ah, that's another good point.
He's like, I really wanted to see him get his butt kicked.
All right, that is it. I think a very good issue. Once again, it would have been nice if it were inked by Romita, which we had that for about 5 or so issues there, but no more. But DeMeo doesn't do a bad job. It's just that he's not Romita inking himself. So, thoughts on this before we move on to our next issue?
Yes, George, what do you think of this issue?
I was very intrigued by, like we talk about the goon fight with the most broadly telegraphed punch in the history of the world, where it's like 3 panels of like, hold him still, here I come, I got a big hand. Did you all catch the name of that guy?
No.
No, what was his name?
Big Turk. Now, there's a supporting character in Frank Miller's Daredevil who's gone on, he's appeared in the movies. He's a low-rung, I wouldn't even call him a lieutenant. He's like a low-rung figure in crime, probably working under the Kingpin, but definitely not getting meetings in his office, named Turk. And he is a recurring character in Daredevil. Daredevil often beats him up for information. It's a kind of running gag almost. And I'm like, is there a connection? I hope maybe one day I'll do a story for Marvel where it's like Turk from Daredevil is like the son of this guy, Big Turk. Because if you're Big Turk, it does speak to the existence of there being a little Turk or just a Turk. Because why do you need the big otherwise?
Yeah. And I think Turk actually takes over the Stiltman armor at one point to hilarious effect.
Yes.
See, and this family is very talented. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I know that I had done a read through some years back of the entirety of Stan Lee's run on Amazing Spider-Man. And, you move through a lot of different collaborators during that time, most notably there's the Ditko, and then you have Romita, and you just get this feel for, like, when Romita comes on, there does seem this period where they become very interested in telling these sort of less flashy, for lack of a better term, mobster characters.
Mm-hmm.
Kingpin seems superhumanly strong. He's got like a lot of gadgets, like the gas cravat and the disintegrator beam in his cane, but he ends up appearing a lot. I think he is a more recurring villain during the Romita years than any other character. As that era is beginning, where there's Spider-Man fighting a lot of goons, I like it personally, but I do miss seeing some of those wacky Steve Ditko-esque characters who, as memory serves, a lot of them get kind of backdoored for a while.
Oh yeah,
you're
backdoored. That's not an expression.
You're just looking to revive a guy called Joe. That's your thing.
Well, I mean, he's kind of the pinnacle of characters. Yeah.
But I love the Kingpin. I think the Kingpin is a great addition to the book. And it's not like Ditko had a problem with crime bosses. There were a lot of crime bosses, including Foswell as the big man. When Ditko was doing the book, they were more likely to wear masks, and they were more likely to be a little bit more supervillain-ish than the Kingpin is. But the Kingpin is just a great addition to this book. A huge credit to Romita for introducing him along with Lee, depending on who you want to give credit to it. And obviously a character who would turn out to be a great Spider-Man villain, then later a great Daredevil villain, has been a villain in the movies and TV shows for Daredevil, for Spider-Man, for Hawkeye, for Echo. It's turned out to be just a character who really has a lot of legs.
Yeah, he's one of those characters that a lot of times the character stays linked to the one editorial office or the one book that manifests them. But he's equal parts Spider-Man and Daredevil villain. And so you said he's spread beyond that. Like, Kingpin is great. It's funny to see him in this little bit more, for lack of a better term, super villainy guys here. He's got like gimmicks like the Joker or something. Yeah. It's a nice early appearance by him. Pretty solid issue. I want to commend the storytelling. Like, all the battle scenes are crystal clear. There is that one weird perspective thing, which I still can't make work for me.
Keep working. It's like one of those magic eye posters. If you just keep working at it, it eventually snaps into focus.
Let me just relax my vision and stare at it blankly for a half hour. Oh, there it is. Okay.
Yes. So, shall we move on to, I'm presuming we're doing Daredevil, which is usually what we do after Spider-Man. And if we're also going in the order that we usually go, Matt, you get the honor of one of the great Marvel comics of the 1960s here, Daredevil number 31.
Oh, yes. Legendary. Unfortunately not. Another typically crappy issue of Daredevil. Here comes Daredevil, the man without fear. DD without his superpowers in the most dangerous fight of his life, blind man's bluff. So I gotta say, I like the general concept of this issue, where we find out what it would be like for Daredevil if he was actually blind, if he didn't have a radar sense, and he was trying to be an actual blind superhero, which is great. But so many things about this issue are terrible. Cobra and Mr. Hyde intended to blind Daredevil, not knowing he was blind, which you would think like, well, that's going to be the biggest whiff in all of supervillaindom.
We had that gimmick just like 2 issues ago.
Yeah, they had villains who could make the entire world blind when he was fighting the aliens. But anyway, so then you would think this would be a big whiff, but then it somehow dulls all of his other senses as well and gets rid of his radar sense. So now he really is blind. We see him sort of stumbling home, which I think Gene Colan does a good job with. We should say that this is a Stan the Man Lee and Gene the Dean Colan Thrill-A-Minute triumph, embellished by John Tartaglione, lettered by Artie Simek. I think this may be the first time we've had Gene the Dean as a nickname.
Maybe.
I think that Gene Colan does a good job showing this just utterly blind man stumbling around as he stumbles his way across the city.
And freshly blind.
Yes.
Like, not just, oh, if you're blind, this is what it's like getting around. No, if you're blind, you know how to get around. But no, somebody who has just been blinded and does not have any of those skills. Yeah.
Now, you were pointing out, George, that there are lots of interactions with fans this week. Thor has a fairly anodyne interaction with his fans. This is a terrifying interaction with fans where Daredevil runs into a fan who insists on ripping off a piece of his mask and is just completely unapologetic about it. And it's like, what? Now that you got it, what do you do with it? Put it in my hope chest, of course. Careful, don't get too close to it. Don't even breathe on it. Daredevil is sort of horrified by this whole thing. Daredevil finally gets home, decides to suddenly become Mike Murdock, stop by the office as Mike Murdock. Now, of course, Mike Murdock is supposedly not blind. Why on earth would he do this? Why not stop by the office as Matt Murdock, who is, after all, already known as blind?
I don't get it, right?
So then he shows up and he makes it abundantly clear very quickly that he, Mike Murdock, is now blind. And they're like, you're blind too? And then you get the dumbest line in this issue, which is saying a lot. Now, all Mike Murdock has to do is like, yes, as you know, I'm Daredevil. I was just fighting Mr. Hyde and Cobra. They hit me with a blindness ray, which is true. All he has to do is tell the truth here about how he is now blind. Instead, he tells a ludicrous lie, because, of course, when he is Mike Murdock, he is always lying with these ludicrous lies. Well, so then Foggy says, but Matt's the blind one. I don't get it. And then Mike says, figured out, son, I'm Matt's brother, right? Maybe we were both born with a weakness in our eyes. Only mine didn't hit me till years after Matt's. And then Foggy says, trouble with your eyes, then that's why you always wore those sunglasses. It was more than just an act. Daredevil thinks it's working. He's swallowing it. He still doesn't suspect I'm really Matt. So many things are done here. For one thing, Matt Murdock does not have a congenital weakness with his eyes. He was hit in the face by a radioactive canister. He did not go, he was not born blind.
And you would think that would have come up at some point with these two having been college roommates. What, that never came up?
You should certainly know that Matt could see just fine until he was hit in the face. This makes no sense. This is so stupid. This is so bizarre. We cut to Mr. Hyde and Cobra, who are going around town, figuring out some evil things they could do. And we get Karen, who had switched her allegiance from Matt to Mike, supposedly not because Matt was blind, but she's sure not happy to find out that Mike is now blind too. First Matt's blindness, now you, Mike. It's almost too much to believe. And then she looks very much like the cover of an old romance comic with her crying hair. Well, it looks like the Roy Lichtenstein.
Oh, yeah.
I don't care. I'm not going to let him save me. I'd rather drown. Looks a lot like that. Cobra and Mr. Hyde are on the facing building, threatening to throw things down on the crowd. Matt as Mike, as Daredevil, all three blind, have to cross a tightrope to get to Mr. Hyde and Cobra to stop them. And I think Colin does just an amazing job in the sequence on page 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19 of Daredevil trying to cross a tightrope blind and just absolutely horrified by it the whole time. Turns out to be pointless. The cops basically stop Hyde and Cobra when Daredevil is only halfway across, and then he just goes back to where he started. So it was a completely pointless 5-page sequence, but I think really gorgeously penciled by Colin and passively inked by Tartaglione. I'm not a big fan of Tartaglione's inks. Finally, Daredevil is on his way home talking to Foggy, and then suddenly Foggy's voice changes a little bit, and he doesn't realize that Foggy has at this point been, presumably killed. Foggy has been somehow grabbed by Cobra and dragged off. Matt does not realize that it is no longer Foggy's hand on his shoulder. It is now the Cobra's hand. He says, Foggy, where are you? Do you hear me? What happened? And Cobra says, nothing to worry about. I'm okay. I just forgot for a second that you still really are blind. So blind that he does not realize this is now Cobra, which is very blind. But oh well. So, George, what do you think of this issue?
Thanks for clarifying what was meant to be occurring that last page, because I'm like, it looks like Foggy gets pulled off. I'm like, does he not realize that that's Cobra? This issue was, I had to read this like 3 times to get sense of this.
No, you didn't.
Oh, good God, I'm so sorry.
Like, I gave it like a pretty cursory read. I'm like, nothing made, like, I've heard about the whole Mike Murdock as twin thing before, and I've really not read much of that. And I'm like, I don't fully understand what's going on there. Stan's normally so good about identifying who all the characters are too. Like this one, first couple scenes that Karen's in, you don't really know that that's Karen. Like they never say who she is. She has the best line in the entire issue, which I can't believe you didn't read. Can I read it?
Oh, please.
When she's talking about how it's almost too much to believe that now Mike Murdock is blind as well. Her first thought is, when I think I had my hair restyled to show Mike, and now I'm like, wow, way to make it all about yourself, Karen.
I had that in a note myself and was going to bring that up in a moment. It's just the most vain thing that you could write for her.
This is such a weird book. This is the perfect opportunity to show up as Matt. Why show up as Mike wearing big glasses and be like, yeah, I'm blind too now. And I really like the character of Mr. Hyde. I mainly knew him from Roger Stern's amazing run on the Avengers, where he's part of the Masters of Evil takeover. He's terrifying. And here it's cool to see him early, but like, man, talk about dysfunctional relationship. He and Cobra do not like each other. Cobra is creepily just like always skulking around in his belly. Like, no wonder he doesn't like him. Imagine hanging with your friend all the time. I get he's a contortionist, but this guy never stands up. He's just always wriggling on the floor like a weirdo.
In New York City.
Yeah, he's so dirty. Yeah, he just goes into pipes too. It's like, should you be wearing light green and purple for this? No, it's just, yeah, Daredevil before his, reinvention by Miller and others. I'm always kind of amazed he lasted as long.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Reading this, I'm like, this Mike Murdock is the most convoluted, weird thing I've ever read. I don't understand it still.
No, it makes no sense.
What happens eventually? Like, spoilers. Does he quote unquote kill off Mike Murdock, if I recall? Is that what happens?
Eventually he has to just admit to Karen, and I think not Foggy, but he admits to Karen, like, look, Matt Murdock is Daredevil, because that's the only way out of the whole Mike Murdock thing, if I remember correctly.
That's how she ends up selling his ID years later.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. Okay. Yeah. No, I've never read any of these issues, honestly. We're beyond where I have read.
No, I haven't read them either, so I have no idea what's going to happen.
So, just some of my thoughts on this. Tartaglione is, and as I've said, in the Sergeant Fury book, Tartaglione actually does a fantastic job on Dick Ayers. I'm generally not a big Dick Ayers fan, generally not a big Tartaglione fan, but somehow they both play to each other's strengths in that book. Here, it's just not working. Page 3, panel 2, that cop whose face we get a close-up on.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's an action figure that was set down on a radiator. That is... that face is melting.
That guy has the gout.
Yeah. So when Daredevil finally takes a cab to get home because he doesn't know how to find his way home, and actually he's been wandering like all night and the sun has come up, he picks up a taxi and he thinks to himself, uh-oh, I wonder how my credit is. I don't have a red cent with me. And then when he gets home, of course, still in his costume, walking into his own front door, apparently Dee Dee's credit is okay, because a few minutes later, and then it's like, wait, what credit? Who? Does Daredevil have his own credit card? Like, what is...
Eventually he's going to get in a cab and go like, hey, I want you to give me a free cab ride because I'm Daredevil. And it's like, look, I just gave Thor 3 free cab rides because he was Thor. I'm broke. I need some of you to pay me.
Yeah, it's weird that it was the same month. It's like they both have a weird interaction where like Thor's like, I don't have money. Like, these superheroes are such freeloaders.
I think that Stan sometimes is just like he's in a hurry that month and he just uses the same plot point more than once just because he needs to get through it. This is not the first time we have seen that happen. It's not the second time. It's not, But yeah, the whole sequence where Daredevil is on the tightrope. Yes, Colin does a fantastic job of showing him nearly falling and trying to catch his balance and all that sort of stuff. But he also sets it up terribly. Look at the final panel on page 14, right before this sequence begins. So how many floors above Hyde and Cobra is Daredevil there? 4, 5? Something like that. So the tightrope they've got is actually going down like 4 or 5 stories across the street. Then when he nearly falls and he's like, oh, I'm going to go back where I came from. You're going uphill. Just keep going down. As a matter of fact, just get your billy club and put it on the rope and take it down like a zip line. Like, what are you? And the thing is, that was an unforced error by Colin because he didn't have to make them that far apart. Also, the street down below on the big panel on page 17, how tiny are those people and how wide are those roads? That's like an Atlanta interstate down there. That is not a New York City street.
That's right. That's like a 20-lane highway. That's insane.
Yeah, it really is. And then we find out that the anchor on the uphill end of this is Foggy literally just holding on to the end of the cable with his hands. So this is in no way, shape, or form a tightrope. This is absolutely a slack rope. And how is he able to even hold that? And some of the, like on the cover, actually, it shows this scene, and the angle of the cable on the cover, the angle changes where he's standing on it and where it goes just make no sense. So yeah, Colin has fun with the lost balance bit, but other than that, there is so many unforced errors in this sequence that
it's 6 pages of a 20-page comic is him on this tightrope. And it ultimately, like you said, he walks out halfway and then walks back. What would his plan have been? If he got there, he would have been facing a super strong maniac and a guy who's slithering on his belly throughout the city. I mean, I love the bit where he calls Foggy Chubbins too. That seems unnecessary.
That is not the first time. This is at least the second or third time that he's called him Chubbins, as well as I think Tubby. He's really abusive to his friend.
Yeah, that's unkind.
And Karen is just flat out like, oh, I'm so into him. Like, oh my God, I was into Matt, but forget that. Now I'm super into Mike, now who is Daredevil and who calls you Chubbins. Like, oh my God, this comic is the ultimate incel nightmare. It's like, oh, that's what the girls love. The girl who I'm in love with now is in love with my bully. This is just awful.
No offense to these legendary creators. I was kind of stunned at how unreadable this was.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That's Daredevil. They get it all out in Daredevil. And then, Daredevil and actually Avengers until recently, and X-Men for that matter. They get it all out there and then save all the good stuff for Fantastic Four and Thor and Spider-Man.
And X-Men famously eventually goes to the bi-monthly reprint status. Yeah. Daredevil never does that, right?
No,
it goes bi-monthly, but not reprint.
Yeah.
Okay, so it did go bi-monthly. Okay.
Yeah. It was bi-monthly for, I think, the entire Mackenzie Miller run, and then also still for the first part of the Miller run, if I'm not mistaken.
It was.
Wow. Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to Submariner and the Incredible Hulk in Tales to Astonish. The cover is a Namor cover. We have Namor being lifted in the air by what looks like a wrestler, saying, Prince Namor, helpless at the hands of Dragor. So the last couple of issues, or maybe one issue, has been drawn by Dan Adkins, which actually I kind of liked. But Bill Everett is now back, who is also very good, and the creator of the character. Majestic Marvel presents a scintillating subaqueous saga from the proud and powerful pens of Stan Lee editor, Roy Thomas scripter, Bill Everett artist, Artie Simek letterer. Warriors born all. We start out with Namor on his throne in a war council, trying to decide if he should go to war with the Surface Men. Of course, all of his generals want glory in battle, so they're saying, yes, we should absolutely do this. Dorma is like, look, guys, this is a bad idea. And, Namor keeps on being like, you forget yourself, woman. You can't talk to your king that way. She then talks to his vizier, who is saying, like, look, man, Atlantis all just turned against him. He basically just wants to unite them in a cause of war, which is, once again, an interesting sort of idea about governance here that, oh, yeah, your people are turning against you. What do? Let's start a war. That'll bring them all together and have them rally around me. Again, Namor is a terrible autocrat for this nation, and I do not like it, or I do not like the situation. I do not really like him when he is written as a protagonist. There is some kind of a challenge that comes from the surface world from this leader called Dragor, who is asking Namor to ally with him to put down a resistance or a rebellion. And so Dorma is just like, this is beneath you. Just ignore this. And he's like, no, I can't just let this go. I've got to, let this person know how impudent this is. And I'm going to go and tell him myself. And we see that there is this character called the Gnome who appears to be advising this dictator called Dragor. Spoiler alert. Dragor is the gnome, but, we will get to that in a minute. So Namor is coming up to the surface near this seaside nation, somehow ends up getting trapped with some electric netting, really doesn't seem to track for me much at all, and then meets the dictator, Dragor, who definitely looks like this human suit does not fit me, because in actuality, this human suit does not fit him. So
that's good. So that's good art by Everett, who is indicating,
I would like it to seem a little more convincing that this would be a human being. That's my problem.
No, I think it's great. I think that he is foreshadowing here. He is drawing what is really going on. And I think Everett's pencils are great on this issue. His inks are even better. I really, just as he did a great job inking Thor this month, he does a really good job inking himself here. There's just a tremendous amount of weight and shadow here.
Yes, he is a fantastic inker. And textures and everything as well. That's one thing I didn't mention actually in the Thor issue is just the luscious textures that he gets in his backgrounds and stuff like that. It becomes clear that Dragor is a new dictator. He has just taken over what had been a democratically governed country, and these rebels are actually partisans who are trying to take back the country. Somehow Dragor, and I forget, something gets control over Namor and makes him do his bidding. On page 8, Everett seems to be having fun drawing Namor doing the stuff he was doing in World War II, fighting tanks and grabbing missiles and all sorts of stuff like that. Eventually, though, Namor starts losing his strength because, of course, he needs water. So Dorma knows that he is going to get weak and so goes to find him, and she takes one of her air-breathing potions. And so she comes in with her squirt gun and starts squirting.
It's a super soaker,
Yeah. So she squirts on Namor. He now gets his power back. He then is able to break the hypnosis or whatever, go and fight Dragor, and out the back pops the gnome from the Dragor robot.
Well, at first she just brought her super soaker to soak Namor to give him more powers, but then she's like, I suspect that's a robot. I'm gonna try the super soaker on him. And Dragor is like, water, no. And she successfully guessed that this was a robot.
Yes, and with no waterproofing whatsoever. So anyway, at the end, Namor is being very mean to them. He doesn't care about them, being very haughty. The rebels say, "Such harsh tones can never make us forget our debt to you, my friend. Even now, we prepare for free elections," as though things are that easy. And then Namor says, "Freedom, liberty, how easily such words roll from the tongues of surface men. But what care they for the safety of Atlantis?" Which, okay, yeah, they don't care for the safety of Atlantis. And they're always being careless about that. But once again, Namor being so contemptuous of things like freedom and liberty. Again, I do not like him as a ruler, and I would like to see him not be a ruler anymore or be treated as a villain, personally.
Well, wait, you skipped over the most ridiculous part of this issue where the gnome comes out the back of Dragor and then decides, now I will leap to my death out the window. But then the rebels are out in the courtyard and they have a firefighter's net.
Oh, yes.
How on earth did they know to be there with that net? How on earth did they know that? He says he plummets into a net held by a group of rebels. I mean, there's really no other use for a firefighter's net for catching someone who has jumped out of a building. It's not like they were going around doing something else with this net.
I will point out there is one other thing, which is they then turn it upside down and use it to trap him.
Yes.
So that's a second use for it, apparently. And just the one other thing that I had to point out is just on page 5, at one point when the Submariner is being zapped with whatever this control thing is, the sound effect is actually FAP, which I found funny. Okay, so, all right, that's it. What say V about this part of the story before we move on to Hulk?
I love the art. I love the gnome. I'm sad this is his only appearance, though the fact that he's a little tiny genius inventor who's inside of a giant suit of armor reminds me very much of what they did in the 80s when the Gremlin was the Titanium Man.
But what it reminds me of is in the Roger Stern, John Buscema, excellent, legendary run on Avengers in the 80s.
Yeah.
There's the Terminus storyline, and Terminus is the exact
same
way.
Oh, you're right. There too. Yeah.
Any other thoughts before we move on?
I talk about in one of my books about the hero of the book versus the hero of the scene. Sometimes you'll have someone like Buffy the Vampire Slayer who is our hero because we're investing our hopes in her to solve the problem. But every time she interacts with Willow, Buffy is usually wrong and Willow is usually right. And Willow is often the hero of the scene, even though Buffy is the hero of the story. That is very much getting to be the case with Namor and Dorma. Dorma is always right and Namor is always wrong. And even though we're investing our hopes in him to, defeat Dragor and be the ultimate hero of the story, every time that he is in a scene with Dorma, she is very much the hero of the scene.
Yeah, it speaks very much to that idea you were saying. Like, Namor needs to be the anti-hero at best. And if you have him this protagonist, how do you make him every once in a while to smash up a battlefield and throw some tanks? Well, he's wrong, but Dorm is there to set him straight.
Yep. No. All right, so let's move on to the Incredible Hulk, To the Beckoning Stars, also featuring the New Man. We don't know how anyone as utterly adorable as Smilin' Stan Lee and mirthful Marie Severin can do such a great job on the hideous Hulk, but they do. Perhaps it's because of Herb Trimpe's inking and Sam Rosen's lettering. Quien sabe? So,
wow.
Again, just having tons of fun with this.
I think this is the first time we've had Trimpe inking Severin on Hulk. I think Trimpe has been inking Severin on Doctor Strange and not on Hulk. Of course, Trimpe will go on to be a legendary penciler of Hulk and will go ahead and have a very long run as penciler on Hulk. But here we have him as inker over Marie Severin, who has a shorter run.
So Hulk had just been trying to convince Silver Surfer to take him off planet, not knowing that Silver Surfer was trapped on the planet and was probably the worst person to ask to do that. He is now very upset and lashing out at the scenery. There are a couple of seeming hunters nearby who take down a caribou, although they apparently haven't killed it. They've just wounded it and stunned it, I guess they said, which I don't think you really stun animals with a gun like that, unless you've got a phaser. But Hulk comes around and sees them, and this is really, I think, the beginning of the Hulk as gentle giant, friend to animals, enemy to humans, in quite this mode that we have seen. But that definitely will be a running part of his character for decades after this. These seeming hunters end up running back to this high-tech communications thing and sending a beamed message to another planet, whereupon resides the High Evolutionary. He tells them, "Oh, you ran into the Hulk? Dude, definitely bring me him. That's going to be awesome." They're like, wait, what? We then get a bit of backstory. High Evolutionary is ending up on this planet. Now, have we established if this is actually Counter-Earth? Or sorry, will we establish that this is actually Counter-Earth, but they haven't named it yet?
Yes, I believe the idea is that this is already Counter-Earth, unless he starts over again, once again, on a new planet. They don't say what planet he's on here, but I believe this will be revealed to be a planet much like Earth on the opposite side of the sun. Then later, this will all be excellently used in Guardians of the Galaxy, although Counter-Earth is in the Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, and High Evolutionary is there, and he's raising his new men there. But I don't think they say there that it's directly on the other side of the Earth from the sun. Okay. But the idea there is he's just started a new Earth way out in space, I think.
Well, we get some backstory here that since we last saw him in Thor, his so-called new men, who are essentially anthropomorphic animals that he has so-called, quote-unquote, evolved with some sort of technology, have started to devolve back to their animal nature, and the society he was trying to build is collapsing. So he's trying to get more animals to experiment on to try to get this stuff right. The hunters are able to use a gas pellet to knock the Hulk out. This actually has been established before now, if I'm not mistaken, and will remain a long-running thing, that the Hulk is vulnerable to gas attack. As a matter of fact, I think in the DC Marvel crossover where he fights Batman, that's how Batman is actually able to defeat him for a while. So then these hunters load him onto this ship and send the ship into space. It turns out, though, that then there is one of the new men, who I'm guessing is one who has not begun to revert back to his animal nature. He's still dressed up like a high-tech medieval knight, and he is there to watch over the Hulk. The guy's like, wait, why isn't this animal actually in a cage like they usually are? What's going on? So Hulk gets out of his stupor, knocks the new man out, and then realizes he's on a spaceship, which is just what he's been wanting for the last couple of issues. He wants to go to another planet to get away from all these stupid humans who always keep bothering him. We have this really interesting sequence of 6 panels on the last page where you just see the spaceship receding into the distance in the solar system here, and you just get this dialogue from the Hulk. I don't know how it happened, but at last I'm leaving Earth. I'm going into the sky to some new world. It doesn't matter if I'll live or die. All that matters is the Hulk will have a second chance. Marie Severin really knocked it out of the park with that particular sequence, I think.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't think I really have anything else to say about this issue. Why don't we ask George first? What do you have to say?
I remember when I was doing a reading just from the beginning of like all these Hulk and Namor adventures, like the Hulks were often kind of slogs. Like I enjoyed the Namor stuff a lot more. Reading the Hulks, I'm like, what is going on here? This is just a mess. And I remember this particular story standing out is like you said, it seems like finally, after all these years of the Hulk, they're sort of settling into like the classic version or he wants to be left alone. His speech patterns are getting a little bit coarser. It's almost like this becomes the template for the Hulk going forward. So I agree with you. That last sequence, 6 panels slowly pulling out as Hulk muses upon his own mortality. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting little story. Like the Hunters, like pretty funny that they take down Hulk with 2 shots of a gas pellet, but you know.
Yeah, something that the entire U.S. Army has been unable to do.
Yeah, he's outside too. Like, Hulk, hold your breath for like 30 seconds. You know, just you're fine. Yeah. But it's actually, I remember it being a bit of a, in my opinion, a minor turning point for the adventures of this character who I think he struggled a bit longer to find his story than a lot of the other classic Marvel heroes.
Yeah, I would largely disagree with you. I've always found the Hulk half the book to be more entertaining than the Namor half the book. And obviously we had Kirby for a long time on Hulk. We had Ditko for a long time on Hulk. And I found those to be much better than the artists that we've had on Namor for the most part. But I think that both books are singing along pretty well right now. I think Everett's doing a great job. You know, we had Dan Atkins for a couple of years doing a great job on Namor. Now we've got Everett doing a good job again. And the back half of the book, I'm a huge fan of Marie Severin. I like Trimpe's inks on her. I think this is a really excellent story. And I'm very glad to see the High Evolutionary again. Very glad that we have more of this sort of New Earth storyline, which was later explored so well in Guardians of the Galaxy 3. This is an excellent issue. I think it's interesting that the Hulk wants the same thing 2 issues in a row. One of the big problems of this book has always been that the Hulk wants something absolutely different in every issue. But now we have 2 issues in a row where he wants to get off the Earth, which is like, oh, okay, consistent character development. Okay, this is sort of a new thing for the Hulk. That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I love how it's like the Hulk finds out he's been kidnapped by some sort of alien races being shanghaied off the Earth. He's like, oh my God, I've been kidnapped. I'm in a spaceship. Great. Okay. That's what I wanted.
Yeah, I recognize that feeling, by the way.
Yeah.
All right.
But it says, and I should say it says that next issue, A World He Never Made. And we can discuss it at the time, but there was a great Brian Cronin article discussing Marvel's history with the phrase A World He Never Made and how the original poetic origins of it and all that. But we can get into that next time. We should keep going and finish out the first of our 2 episodes with X-Men.
Yes. And I believe I just did the previous issue, so why don't you do this one?
Okay, let's go into X-Men number 35, Along Came a Spider. So big tease here. We have another Dan Atkins cover, but Dan Atkins does not do the inside. Instead, Werner Roth is back, but we've got good news, everybody. This is Werner Roth's last issue, and indeed, I believe his last ever Marvel comic. We have Along Came a Spider. We begin with the Banshee, who already has a more normal human-looking face than he had last time we saw him, even though I believe that was also penciled by Roth. The Banshee is tooling around in the Swiss Alps for some reason, looking for Factor 3. He encounters a spider robot who he briefly fights. Then he finds a little Radio Shack where he can try to call the X-Men. He warns them about the spider robot, but all he actually says is beware the spider, and unfortunately, that gets misinterpreted. Bizarrely, we cut to Peter Parker. I've said before, your whole job as a comic book writer is to get the 2 people who are going to fight in the same place at the same time and give them a reason to fight. You've got to do that for the first 10 pages of the story, and then you have to show them fighting for the second 10 pages of the story. And that's a comic book. And your whole job is to get them in the same place at the same time. And if you do a good job at that, you're a good writer. And if you do a bad job at that, you're a bad writer. Well, here we have Spider-Man. As we know, Spider-Man does have a motorcycle, but seems to spend all of his time in the city in his own book, tooling around, going from Queens to Manhattan and back on his motorcycle. Then suddenly, here he is in the X-Men book as a guest star, and he has decided to go on a motorcycle ride up to Westchester County for no good reason. And he says, you know, it's funny how I just hopped on my cycle and ended up here in Westchester County. It's almost like fate was pulling me here for some mysterious reason I can't even imagine. Oh, come on, Parker, you just got lost. Don't make a big thing of it. This is always your sign of bad writing, when someone is like, oh, there's no good reason for me to have done this, but maybe fate has played a hand. It's like, I can't explain it. The writer can't explain it. So let's just say that maybe there was an ineffable reason why it happened.
Well, the last line of dialogue in that panel, though, says, oh, well, after the last run-in with the Kingpin, so nice continuity, maybe a lost weekend is just what I need. Now, I mean, Lost Weekend has a cultural meaning. Right? It has a meaning in our culture. Just like 20 years earlier, a movie called Lost Weekend had won like all the big Oscars. And to this day, like 80 years later, still when I hear Lost Weekend, I think an alcoholic getting into possibly his last bender before the end.
Yes.
And so this was only 20 years earlier. I'm sure that anyway, that just jumped out at me.
Yes. So then he ends up in upstate New York, and whoops, he encounters Factor 3's flying UFO with the spider robot inside it. And he fights it for a while, and the X-Men get some sort of alert of this of, oh, something's going north of us. Now, they really shouldn't get an alert because neither Spider-Man nor the robot are mutants, but they get some sort of alert about it. And Spider-Man is fighting the robot. I usually have very few positive things to say about Werner Roth's art, but I like the sequence on page 10 where Spider-Man realizes that the robot's eye stalk is on a tentacle and it's shooting lasers, and Spider-Man realizes he can just force it down and have it shoot itself. Sort of.
Why do you keep blasting yourself?
Exactly. So then, unfortunately, the spider robot completely disintegrates. So, well, that's good because it was evil. But now Spider-Man can't explain when the X-Men show up and they're like, we've heard there's some sort of spider menace around here, and you're the only thing that seems to fit the bill, Spider-Man. And he's like, no, there was a spider robot. What are you talking about? And instead, he gets in a big fight with the X-Men that goes on for several pages. They leave Jean behind for some reason, who is standing by the computer trying to get in contact with Banshee again.
Have we seen Banshee's Vulcan ears before? Did he have those in his previous appearance?
No, I don't believe so. What elfin ears? What's going up with that? That's very strange.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I guess maybe that's supposed to be part of he looks like a leprechaun or something. Do leprechauns have pointy ears? I don't know. That's a weird decision.
That is. Anyway, eventually Spider-Man and the X-Men are able to figure everything out. He's like, no, there was a spider robot. That's what the real villain was. And they're like, oh, okay, let's just all go our separate ways. And they go back to Jean, and Jean and Scott moon over each other, and they say, next issue, Meccano. And so that is this issue. George, what did you think about this issue?
It's like you all said, like the amount of coincidences. Like, I'm like, okay, so beware the spider, it's Spider-Man, but like, they're like, why is Peter Parker up there? Like, on his alcoholic bender? Like, why? It's just, my reading of, pre-Claremont X-Men is pretty spotty, but I thought it was kind of I never knew there was an issue where they fought Spider-Man. I had seen early pictures of Banshee where he looks like the world's most offensive Irish stereotype come to life.
Okay.
I guess it is a bit scaled back here. Like that first panel of him, I'm like, okay, he has the space between his nose and upper lip isn't like 3 miles anymore.
Yep.
But, he does have the weird pointy ears. Like this was, I was just thinking, like, if I bought this, I'm like, what would make me want to read this title again? Like the X-Men themselves, like, come off as very bland. Yeah, it just kind of stunk.
Yeah, he has those pointy ears, as the Irish do.
Well, I was wondering, was that actually an Irish stereotype? Because like his first appearance, he's definitely drawn like the equivalent of like a racial slur.
It's the Irish ape, which was basically a racial slur. Yes,
So I wonder if the ears was part of the Irish ape.
I don't think so. I don't know. It's just weird.
Yes, I presume with the name George O'Connor that you are of Irish extraction.
And I do have pointy ears, and I would thank you not to draw attention to it.
Yeah, well, Matt and I are both 50% Irish as well. So
more than that.
So therefore, we happen to get our dad's ears, so we don't have the pointiness.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm a little bit less than 50%, but yeah, I certainly don't look like Banshee. I'll say that.
I gotta say, there's something about X-Men that I meant to mention earlier that I didn't. So, George, my first awareness of you was when the very first Olympians book came out. So what year would that have been when the first Olympians book came out? That would have been...
I think 2010.
Yes, 2010. I was working at First Scholastic at the time, and my wife reviews children's books. I may have seen it through that. I may have seen it through working at Scholastic. And I saw these books, and it was a very interesting time for children's graphic novels, because I read that first Olympians book and I said, wow, who is this guy? He's a great artist. And this is art that he could be doing superhero art based off what I'm seeing of his art. And this guy could get a job drawing the X-Men. This is specifically what I thought. This guy could get a job drawing the X-Men, and he could actually make a living at this. Because I was still assuming that children's graphic novels were sort of a flash-in-the-pan fad that wasn't going to last, and that no one would ever be able to make a living doing children's graphic novels. And that if you were doing a good job at children's graphic novels, then what you were trying to do was you were trying to get a job at Marvel Comics drawing the X-Men.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean... as a younger person, I tried to do the job for Marvel, and I've done like a little bit here and there, but like I have noticed that there's this unfortunate tendency when you work in the quote unquote mainstream comics that you have a career that only goes for so many years. And then, I don't know, at the end of it, you played in somebody else's sandbox the whole time and you don't get to own anything.
Yep.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, I was totally wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the way I read Matt's story there is just, wow, I can't predict the future at all.
Yes, I was not understanding.
No, I get it. I appreciate it. Thank you for the compliment. Like, American superhero comics, particularly Marvel and such, like it played such a huge part in what I read and love and enjoy. And you did mention your wife, and I want to say, like, she was such an early proponent of Olympians. Like, I think she reviewed the first book right out the gate.
Yeah.
She gave me a lot of high profile reviews, a lot of places. If you don't know the work of Betsy Bird, she's like what I call like an Uber librarian. She's one of those people who goes out there and puts the spotlight on books, and I owe her a lot. I'll just say that.
Yeah. Well, that's great to hear. I'm sure that would mean a lot to her to know that she helped those books because she was a big fan of them. I was a big fan of them. We were both early proponents of them. And having Betsy as an early proponent is a lot more useful than having Matt Bird as an early proponent. She helps people a lot. When the first Diary from a Wimpy Kid book came out, it didn't sell very well. And then Betsy really championed it. And it soon became just a massive cultural juggernaut. But to prove that, this isn't just a family story, that she had something to do with it, she is thanked in the second book for her work promoting the first book.
Nice.
So this is actual proof on the page that Betsy had a huge part in the success of those books, which obviously went on to some success, but I'm so glad she could help you as well.
Sounds like I got to start thanking her.
Yeah, it's
get that into my next book.
So George, were you certain that you would make a living doing children's graphic novels? How late in your career were you thinking, like, I may have to get a job doing Marvel comics instead if children's graphic novels turns out not to be a way to make a living?
That's a good question, because I think the way I spaced out in terms of like my being set into the world of comics, I kind of graduated school and was ready to be a professional just in time for the bottom to fall out of mainstream comics.
You and me both.
Yeah. So I was very much like, this looks like a terrible business model. So while I was at school, I went to a school called the Pratt Institute. Mm-hmm. It was always between two things for me: children's books and comics. Comics looked like the terrible business model. I worked at this amazing children's bookstore called Books of Wonder in Manhattan. Mm-hmm. And I got to learn a lot about the industry of children's books. And so for me, it was very much like, well, do I become one of these people who, like, where the entire industry fell out? And also, I really wasn't digging what was being done at that time, comics wise, for the most part anyway. Or do I break into kids' books? So I had all this insider knowledge, and I got to see a lot of how books were made on the children's book side of things. So that's what I pursued. And I actually broke in doing children's books for some years before I ever did a graphic novel. But my first real big kids book was this book called Kapow, which is about a little boy pretending to be a superhero. It was published in, I want to say 2001, 2002, something around then. I did it at Simon & Schuster, and the designer on that book who got teamed up with me because he liked comic books too was this guy, Mark Siegel, who in just a few short years would go on to be the founder of the graphic novel imprint First Second over at Macmillan. So for me, then it became a thing where, like, I was, despite my obvious love for superhero comics, I viewed that industry with great wariness and distrust after what I had seen what had happened in like the late 90s. And it had built itself up into something I was appreciating more, but it wasn't a pool I was eager to jump into because I'm like, I just don't understand that. But what Mark was doing at First Second was, create your own books where you got to do about whatever you wanted. And as much as I love superheroes and do enjoy their stories, I just didn't want to spend my career doing that. So with Mark as the editorial director of this new imprint, I was like, maybe that's a field that I could like do some of these comics in, because as much as I love picture books, I don't think I'm necessarily great at them. I think there's a different set of art and skill to make this perfect 32-page gem of a book. I need a little bit more space in which to tell it. So I was able to transition into doing comics for the children's book market. In response to your question, I guess I just had blind faith it would work out, because for me, it was always like comics had started out as this thing for kids. And sometime during the 80s, maybe during the Shooter era, people just kind of chased after the same dynamic as it got grayer and grayer. But I'm like, we really need to do something to recapture this interest. My book, Kapow, I mentioned, was designed specifically to appeal to young people about comics, what made comics great. So I guess I had this blind faith it would always work out.
So you were never like, because I mean, Mark Maron on his podcast always talks about like, yeah, at what point did you think like, well, if this doesn't work out, I could still teach? He has comic comedians whenever they appear on the show. And so I'm asking you, at what point did you think, well, if this doesn't work out, I can always do X-Men? But you were never there. You were never thinking that.
No, man, if I drew X-Men, I'd have to draw cities and stuff. I hate drawing cars. I hate drawing. There's a reason I tell mythological stories. You know what? Never have to draw a car. Never have to draw like, 5-dimensional view of a city. Like I just get to draw the stuff I really like.
Never have to draw a wall of high-tech machinery in the background, any of that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Like I get to draw like cool organic shit.
It always seemed that way with John Buscema to me, where John Buscema seems to love Conan the most out of everything because he doesn't like technology. I think that I think you may be the same case. For some reason, I saw you right and I'm like, this guy could be drawing X-Men. There was something specifically about it. I don't know, in terms of the way you were drawing the Olympians.
This guy's a real Werner Roth is what you were thinking. I feel bad. I didn't realize this was his last issue too.
Yeah. What do you think of Werner Roth as an artist, George?
I mean, I don't want to say anything bad. Like it's solid. I will say this. I hate the way he draws Iceman.
Yes.
And I hate the way he draws Cyclops.
Well, that's already 40% of the X-Men who you're condemning here.
Yeah. His Cyclops especially. It's like, what's going on? But he draws a pretty good beast.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just like, this is some uninspired comics. Yeah. And like,
so
here's a question for you two.
Yes.
You have a choice. You can only read one book that month. Is it X-Men or Daredevil? Which do you read?
Daredevil for me all the way. I think Cohen is a much better artist than Roth. And
yes, for sure.
And I think that Stan Lee's absolutely nutty work on Daredevil is more entertaining than Roy Thomas's placeholder work here on X-Men.
Yeah, I'd probably have to agree. But George, when we were asking you, your descriptions of what you might think of Werner Roth do sound kind of similar to what I've said this whole time, which is that he is aggressively adequate.
Yeah, it's just like he's solid, and I always like him a little resistant to like kind of trash these old guys. They were working on like tight deadlines. Like who else knows what's going on? But like, yeah, this stuff is just. I don't know. As a kid, I just know looking at it, I'd be like, I can't imagine the force on Earth that would make me pick up an issue of X-Men in this period.
Okay. Right. So why don't we say our goodbyes for the first episode here, and then we will record the second one. Any final words either of you have about these first 5 books of the month?
I think it's been up and down. It's been good and bad. I don't know. What do you say, George?
I would have to agree. That's just it's like some of the stuff was great. Some of the stuff was less great. It's just been fascinating to see it all in the context. Like this is what was coming out of Marvel in this 1 month. Like all this stuff was being created concurrently, and just to get that whole flavor is very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I am ready to say to everybody goodbye and stay safe out there.
Okay, bye everybody. We will be back soon.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed it, we now have a Patreon where you can show your appreciation. If you've got a few bucks, head over to patreon.marvelrereadclub.com to support us. Also, you can still rate and review us at your podcatcher of choice, and that would be greatly appreciated as well. You can find us online at marvelrereadclub.com, as well as Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and Threads. See you next time.